So we are doing a session of a group of sessions on a program I'm calling Gita from Zero. And the idea behind Gita from Zero is to give a focus in on Bhagavad Gita, and to do it in such a way that it doesn't assume you know anything about Bhagavad Gita. And at the same time, to kind of take things that may be confusing or difficult or might be, controversial, and bring them to the top and, explain them. Everything is connected to Krishna in some way or another, and that includes history, it includes philosophy, it includes Gita, it includes other religions, it includes science, it includes everything. And, I guess my own personal journey has been that I've been trying to figure out how everything is connected to Krishna. And so if sometimes some of these things range sort of far afield, it's because this is all being uploaded as a YouTube channel, and a person coming to Gita from Zero can see which sessions they've missed and see what came before. And, if it was a session that they saw on YouTube, they can see what comes next and follow it in a logical progression. The idea of just a second, let me do a timing clap before I get any further. I always forget to do this. That way I can sync all the devices. Okay, so now the time clap is there. All right, so what we want to do then is kind of understand Bhagavad Gita and understand why it is what it is, why it's important, how it fits in a historical perspective, which is what we're going to talk about today, how it fits in a philosophical perspective, how it fits in a religious perspective, and of course how it fits against a scientific perspective as well, because all these things are natural ideas that we have in our minds when we are thinking about Bhagavad Gita, or for that matter, any philosophy, because philosophy has to kind of deal with everything. Last week we talked about philosophy means thinking about thinking. And so we are thinking about who we are in the world, what the world is this world all there is, where are we going, where should we want to go? And these are all things that we cogitate about in our minds. So let me just put this up here so I can tell where we are in time. And Noah, if you can grab the mic in case somebody says something. He's our official microphone person. And since this is being uploaded, then he'll put the mic to your mouth when you're speaking, and that way we can hear your voice. Otherwise, it sounds like something way off in the back of the room and nobody can understand it. Last week we talked about, let me go to, we talked about different editions of the Gita, and we talked about Prabhupada's idea of as it is, what we mean by as it is. And the different perspective people have on the Gita are whatever they are. But Prabhupada had a particular perspective on the Bhagavad Gita, and we say that that's the natural, the original, the real perspective. And people could point the finger that we just like our version, or we're, some chauvinists that like a particular version, and we're looking down our nose at others. But there's a reason for it. And we made some points about that last week. I'm not going to go over them today. And so last week we talked about kind of a philosophical perspective. This week we're going to talk about history in the Bhagavad Gita. So I wanted to start, this is our session today. We're on session 4. We'll do 2 sessions every week. They'll be shorter, that way I can kind of capsulize them and make them 2 sessions on YouTube when there'll just be 1 session as far as from a live perspective. The session today will start off with a Gita excerpt, and then we'll talk about world history and the history of religions and academic Indology. Again, I'm sorry if some of these things seem sort of far afield. I want to have at least 1 Gita excerpt, because otherwise you'll think, well, I came for a Gita class. We're not even talking about the Gita. We're talking about it rather than actually reading from it. But we will include 1 section, and today we have a Gita excerpt. Then we'll talk about where the Gita fits in world history and the history of religions, and something called academic Indology. So that's the session for today. So here is our Gita session for our Gita excerpt for today. Nahi jnanena sadrisham pavitram iha vidyate tatsvayam yoga samsiddha kalenatmani vindati. In this world, there is nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. Such knowledge is the mature fruit of all mysticism, and one who has become accomplished in the practice of devotional service enjoys this knowledge within himself in due course of time. This verse is from 4th chapter of Bhagavad Gita. It's 4:38. And we can understand from this verse what we mean. One of the things we get right away is that the concept of knowledge in Bhagavad Gita and in Vedic culture is very different from the concept of knowledge we have in Western thinking. So in Western thinking, knowledge usually means that we learn a group of facts and figures and possibly some skill sets, and those are all directed at some occupation. So why do we go to school or college? So that we can learn some occupational trade. So we learn all kinds of things. This is not the way universities started out. If you look at the history of universities, even in the Western world, they were originally places where people would learn knowledge in a general sense, and they would learn about the world in general so they could figure out how to apply their lives. And philosophy in general was not just about how to make $1 in the everyday world. It was about how to live life in a satisfying, in a meaningful way. Of course, now all that's been filtered out, and philosophies and academic institution colleges mostly just teach how to make $1. That's basically what they're designed to do. But knowledge here is not that kind of knowledge. What we're talking about here is something a little different, and we can see as we get into Bhagavad Gita that knowledge means something different in Bhagavad Gita. Knowledge means not just that we understand who we are in the world, who God is, but it also means that we know how to act in the world so that we become liberated rather than bound more tightly by what we call the modes of nature, or the entanglement of material life. So that's what's different here. So we have, in this world, there's nothing so sublime and pure as transcendental knowledge. Such knowledge is the sure fruit of all mysticism, and one who has become accomplished in the practice of devotional service enjoys this knowledge within himself in due course of time. So knowledge comes not just by hearing ideas and being able to remember them. Knowledge comes by hearing ideas and applying ideas. We have to hear them and we have to apply them. All right. Any questions about any of that? Yeah. Be sure to mic yourself.
Hare Krishna Maharaj. I like this concept you're talking about applying the knowledge. So I guess my question is sometimes we can put a lot of time and effort towards remembering this knowledge, but how do you suggest we best go about realizing the knowledge and understanding it in its essence and from all angles, and not just the one-dimensional context of reading it sometimes? How do we fully see it from all angles and realize the knowledge?
Yeah, that's a good question. The realization of knowledge is not such an easy thing. It comes by practice, by doing it. If you apply something, say for instance, we take some mundane, type of knowledge, like say musical knowledge. You can hear about how scales work. You can hear what kind of chord progressions are usually used. You can hear about a particular instrument and what its characteristics are. But all of that is just abstraction until you start playing the instrument. Then when you play the instrument, you actually get the muscle skills to be able to do things in real time. And you begin to understand why you care about scales. You can understand why chord progressions make a difference. You can learn, how my particular instrument works, what it can do, what it can't do, and so on and so forth. So in a similar way, that's the way this is. You have jnana and vijnanam. So jnanam is theoretical knowledge, and vijnanam is realized knowledge. So we can tell you that you're not the body. We can tell you that by regulating the senses, you will develop a sense of freedom. If you never do any of those things, if you never try to regulate your senses, it's just, theory. It means nothing. It sounds like, anything anybody could say, a talking head on YouTube or wherever it is. People say all kinds of things. But if you actually try the process, then you see, oh, this actually works. I want to do so many things that I know are not good for me, but I'm voluntarily restraining myself from doing them. And I find that over time, I feel better about my life. I don't feel, worse about my life. And I have something to substitute for the things I would have been doing that weren't so good for me. So that again is when you hear something, you put it into practice in your life, and it actually works, then you get realization. When you hear something and you do it once or twice, you get skillful at it, you get used to it, and you see that it actually does something. It becomes part of you. And so that's what we mean by, knowledge and realized knowledge and just theoretical knowledge. Any other questions about that Gita excerpt? All right, so we're going to move down. I'm trying to keep these things very short. Since today our focus is history, the Bhagavad Gita, according to the Vedic texts, was written 5,000 years ago. We're going to talk about how, if you were taking this as a religion course, a comparative religion, or a Indology or Hindu course or something like that in the college, they would not tell you that. They would instead say that the Gita is much more recent, you know. Why do they say that? Today we're going to talk about that, you know. But the first thing off the bat when we talk about human history is that history is always mystery. That we don't have any time machines, and all we have is what people have said about the past. They could have been mistaken. They could have been looking at things from one side of vision. They could have had motivations to spin things in one direction or another. We never know. And so there are many historical accounts about different things, and so some we feel are more reliable and others less reliable. But in any case, to some extent, history is mystery. And that is why we have controversies. And if you look into history, you'll find that some groups of historical scholars say it's like this, other groups say it's like that. It will always be that way. So I'm, of course, presenting a particular spin, and everybody else is too. But I'm trying to give some reasons for why we describe things the way we do. So, first of all, mostly history and historical records are spotty. We're going to learn that in particular, if you try to do historical examinations of the Vedic culture, it's mentioned a lot. I guess I should mention this book because it's a very important book. This book is called Readings in Vedic Literature. It was written by Satsvarup Das Goswami. And this book is talks about some of these points, especially the idea that when historians tried to delve into Sumerian history or the temples in Egypt or whatever it is, there are hieroglyphics, and some of them were written in stone, and you know, all this kind of stuff. So the Sumerians had cuneiform, which they did with stylus into clay, and the clay hardened, and that's pretty long-lasting. However, the Vedas were usually written on palm leaves, and palm leaves don't last very long, so they had to be rewritten and rewritten and rewritten. And there were not, a lot of people who wrote history of India as history. History was indistinguishable from the Vedas. The Vedas were history, so there was no reason to write a different history, So modern scholarship is iffy about the Vedic explanation of its own history. Of course, if we look at modern scholarship, we see that the modern scholars look at the Old Testament and they wonder, can we take this seriously? Modern scholars look at the New Testament and they think, is this serious? Was this really the way it happened, or people are making stuff up? And we see that, in general, we look at Egypt, or we look at the Sumerian history, or we look at Islamic history. The tendency is to believe that these scriptures are, there are fantastic things in them, and certainly in the Vedas, we have flying machines in the, ancient times. We have, Brahma with 4 heads. We have all these amazing things, but you have that in the Bible too, and you have that in, people walked around the city of Jericho and blew horns, and the things came down, the walls came down. So all this stuff is why modern scholars don't take the actual history that comes from either the Bible or the Vedas or whatever we're talking about. They don't take it seriously. Sumerians had the same kind of things. Egyptians had their things. And because all these fantastic stories are there, that's why scholars don't take literally any scripture. They don't take the way the scripture is written as could be the real thing that happened. They feel that these people were smoking something or whatever it was, and they came up with these amazing stories. So they don't take it seriously. And so in this way, we see that historians have biases. And last week we talked about these axioms that people hold when they have philosophy. So people in historical circles have certain biases. They have certain axioms they hold. And mostly they hold that there's no such thing as supernatural causes, and that things that were magical or out of our normal way of seeing the world work, what we would call paranormal, these things could not have happened. So these people had to be making it up. And therefore, that's why historians don't take the Vedas seriously. They don't take the Bible seriously. They don't take the Quran seriously. They don't take any ancient scripture seriously. They look at it as to what probably happened if we have a very hard materialistic look at things. So, okay, I'm going to go through the rest of this pretty quickly here. Archaeology is controversial. Problem with archaeology is we just have fragments of what's going on there. We're trying to build a picture of how people did things thousands of years ago and what they thought. We have broken pots, and sometimes we have some carvings on walls or scratchings on some kind of stone. Sometimes we have some buildings. Sometimes we have things we just don't understand what in the world they could be. So archaeology, there's nothing wrong with archaeology, but it only goes so far, And so when we look at history, we find that theories make a lot of difference. So depending on what theory you have, for instance, if you believe Darwin's theory, you're going to have a certain spin on ancient history. If you believe in linear time, which it means that most Western philosophy and even Western religion has this idea that we started off as cave people or something like that, very, very, very primitive, and as the years went by, we got a little bit more sophisticated. We learned about fire. We learned how to use the wheel. We learned how to, do things. And now we are much more sophisticated. Now we've got iPhones and jumbo jets and so many different things, So this is our linear time. We go from very crude, very brutish, unintelligent, almost animal-like people, and we come to the modern person who walks around in a suit, goes to work every day, with a briefcase, carrying his, iPhone and his laptop and the whole thing. So again, most history is based on there cannot be supernatural causes. So anytime you read anything supernatural, this must have been some kind of hyperbole, some kind of, mental flight of fancy, or people back then just had a wild imagination, but we can't take it literally. And we see that the Vedic time scale, the Indian time scale, is vast. Unlike other religions, the Vedic time scale goes back millions of years. And the Vedas talk about cultures on this planet millions of years ago, which, according to Darwin's theory and, chemical evolution, all this couldn't have been there because according to, modern theories about how humans evolved, that 250,000 years ago or something is around the time when humans were, kind of human. Before that, they were kind of half monkeys or something like that, So, but this time keeps getting pushed back because we find older and older examples of where something comes bubbling up from somewhere that shows humans must have been around millions of years ago, which makes no sense, at least according to the linear time, the Darwin's theory, the chemical evolution theory. If you believe those, this can't have happened. But if you don't believe those, then why couldn't it have happened? And there's archaeological evidence that this does go back. And then we can get into these books like Forbidden Archaeology that are Michael Cremo or Drew Takarma and Sadaputa wrote, Richard Thompson, so they wrote a book called Forbidden Archaeology, where they actually, Forbidden Archaeology is for people who are actually archaeologists. It's dry, it's huge, it has all the actual case histories, their cross-references. This is not stuff people make up. But they've all these archaeological evidences have been suppressed and put in the back rooms because they don't fit the short history of time, the time where we have linear time, Darwin's theory, and chemical evolution, so they don't fit. So that's why they've been put in the, we don't know about this, let's forget about it bag, So that's kind of where all this comes from. But there's another book called The Hidden History of the Human Race, which is also by Thompson and Cremo, but it's a little more for people who are not archaeologists. It's written in a way you can understand. Then there's this book, which is a very good book, Searching for Vedic India by Devamrita Swami. And this book is a book that talks about many of these things, how not so long ago, we were convinced that humans could not have been any more ancient than, say, 100,000 or 60,000 years. Now that's obviously wrong. So it's been pushed back. And every few months we're finding things. And we're starting to see even on the internet that there is an avalanche of strange things in the distant past that make no sense according to our common modern thinking. The Egyptian pyramids are built at a precision that buildings in downtown Manhattan don't match. So that's strange. How did these ancient people have a technology that beats out our modern technology? Something isn't quite clicking there. And we see that there are all these examples of huge construction projects all over the world, and they're ancient. And we don't know who did them. Places like Tiwanaku, Derinkuyu, Göbekli Tepe, you see these things all the time. Even the Egyptians, we see that they had something that must have been what we would call diamond saws, because some of the Egyptian slabs are perfectly flat. They're cut. You cannot make a perfectly flat surface by somebody chiseling on it with a hammer. It's not possible. The only way you can make a perfectly flat surface is by a saw. And there's even, if you look at some of these cuts, you'll see that there's places where the saw went off a little bit. And you see double cuts. And you see, like you would if you were going to a lumber yard and you saw somebody building a house or something like that, throwaway parts where, it broke in the middle or something like that, and they sawed it. So these things would not be possible unless there was some higher technology at a very old time, So now we're seeing more and more that this idea of what history is, deep history, how far back does the human race go? Our modern, thinking is, 250,000 years, maybe a little bit more ancient than that. Vedas talk about millions of years. and that we are living on a planet where we've done things, built up civilizations, those civilizations have been wiped out, and then new civilizations have happened, one over another. The Vedas talk about cyclical time, not linear time. Things happen over and over again, like the seasons, that there is a spring, a summer, fall, and finally a winter, so this is why when we talk about history and why some people will debunk Bhagavad Gita or make it mythological, that there's reasons why we can take it as it says it is, that we don't have to necessarily write it off, because there's reasons to believe that the Bhagavad Gita is saying what it really means and that is accurate about what it is describing. Any questions about that?
So when you talk about Vedic timeline, you're talking about cycle of yugas, right?
Yeah.
So, okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So just to give you an idea, we're living in what's called Kali Yuga. Kali Yuga is 432,000 years long. We are 5,000 years into 432,000 years. That means there is 427,000 years left of Kali Yuga. Now, Kali Yuga, strangely enough, is the shortest of the yugas. That the yuga right before us, Dwapara Yuga, was twice as long. The yuga before that, Treta Yuga, was 3 times as long. And before that was Satya Yuga, which was 4 times as long. So when you add 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1, that gives 10. So the entire of all 4 yugas, Satya, Treta, Dwapara, and Kali, is 10 times the duration of Kali Yuga, which means it's 4,320,000 years. That's one yuga cycle. And we find out that that's one yuga cycle, 4,320,000 years. And there are 72 of those cycles, I believe it is, in one Manvantar. And there are 14 Manvantars in one day of Brahma. So that means that there are 14 times 72 thereabouts is about 1,000, which means that therefore an entire day of Brahma, or a kalpa, is 1,000 times the duration of one full 4 yuga cycle. So that means it's 4,320 million years long. So this is the kind of time cycles. Compare this to Bishop Ussher's idea that the Earth is, I think, 6,000 years old or something like that, and started in 4,000 something BC or some such thing. At any rate, we'll take a quick look at these. I don't want to get too deep into the weeds here, but approximate dates. So we have Vedic culture. When were the Vedas really? No, the Vedas were written, according to the Vedas, about 5,000 years ago. But before that, they were spoken. They were not written. How did people remember the Vedas? Well, they had good memories back then, and the Vedas are in verse form. So like a poem, you can remember, because there is a meter to it and a rhythm to it and a, rhyming scheme. So we don't know when the Vedas were written. As a matter of fact, the Vedas themselves say they are emanated at the time the universe is created. So that means they go back not thousands of years. As we just said, they go back millions of years, because there is a partial creation, at the time of every Brahma's day. So at that time, the Vedas come out. They come out from, one account says, from the breathing of Vishnu, from Vishnu's flute, etc., etc. There's different accounts of the way they are enter into the world, and they enter as a sound culture, as a verbal culture. And when people get to the point where their memories are bad, as in they do when we have a Kali Yuga, then they have to be written down because people can't remember anymore. So this is what Vedas did 5,000 years ago. You'll find that in modern Indology, they don't accept this date. They say the Vedas were written from 1,400 years ago or something like that. Generally, they have all these more recent figures. So let's take a quick look at the history of world cultures, particularly from a kind of spiritual, religious point of view. So when did Vedic culture start? We don't know. It goes back as far as anybody can tell. And the Vedas themselves claim to have been given to us at the time the world was created. And the world was created, as we were just saying, at the beginning of a kalpa, making it somewhere, we are not fully 4,320,000,000 years, because we're already about halfway through. So somewhere like 2 billion, years ago, something like that. So Sumerian culture, which is a cuneiform writing that they had, usually our modern scholarship says it's somewhere between 6,000, 5,000 BCE. These are, I'm using really approximate dates here because there is some controversy about some of these dates in some cases. Egyptian culture around, 3,000 BCE. Judaic culture, 1,500 BCE. Israel and Judah, the two different cultures that developed and, that Judaic culture comes out of. Greek culture, about 1,200, 1,500 BCE, 1,200 BCE, Greek culture, and they are mostly our foundation of Vedic philosophy. We don't really hear much about Greek culture until we get into 600 BCE. By the way, BCE means before Common Era. Yeah, mostly. Used to be BC stood for before Christ, but now we use BCE, Common Era. So CE is Common Era. It used to be AD, Anno Dominum. So at any rate. So Greek culture, we have Chinese culture. We hear about the mandate of heaven. The idea that emperors had to do what was divine, and if they did, their culture would flourish, and they had the right to be emperor if they did. Roman culture starts around 500 BCE, and that's the foundation of European culture. And then we have Buddhist culture, 500 BCE, with Shakyamuni, and or Buddha. There's a lot of controversy about this date. Some say it's much, much earlier than that, but usually the accepted date is around 500 BCE. Christian culture, of course, starts with 0 with the birth of Jesus, but before Christian culture gets coalesced into something that's a uniform thing, at least 90 years go by. So, and then that's 90 of the Common Era, and 600 is Islamic culture. So that's when Muhammad lived and Islamic culture began to get formed. So we get an idea of how these things are figure in. Bhagavad Gita, as we hear, was written down. The ideas of Bhagavad Gita were previous to that, but Vyasadeva was the person who wrote it down, and that was around 300 BCE, 3000 BCE, so about 5,000 years ago. So that's where Bhagavad Gita fits into this timetable. Any questions about that before?
So this is just timetable for our Kali Yuga, right? So
yeah.
Actually, like from
right.
Bhagavad Gita, and it starts from Kali Yuga until now, right? Thank you.
Right. Kali Yuga also started around 3,000 years ago. I mean 3,000 BCE. It started about 5,000 years ago. So that's when Kali Yuga started. Before that we had Dwapara Yuga. So Krishna marks the kind of end of Dwapara Yuga and the beginning of Kali Yuga.
What was the Yuga Dharma for Dwapara Yuga again?
Yuga Dharma was deity worship.
So is this why in the Egyptian culture they have a lot of temples and such?
Right.
That makes sense. It all aligns.
Right. Of course, deity worship still existed in Kali Yuga, but it wasn't as perfect as a means to deliver as it was in Dwapara Yuga. All these things have always existed. There was chanting in Satya Yuga, but the main focus was on meditation, and in Treta Yuga there was also chanting and there was deity worship, but the main focus was on yajnas, and then in Dwapara Yuga, there was also chanting and meditation, but the main focus was on deity worship. And so now in Kali Yuga, although there is deity worship, some people do meditation, some people do sacrifices. Those are not recommended. What's recommended is to chant the holy name of the Lord. That's what's effective in Kali Yuga. So now we can see how this time scale, this world culture time scale, fits into a much larger picture, the picture that the Vedas give us. And science has a similar kind of timetable with their geological ages, the Pliocene, Eocene. They have all these big, huge, epochs of time. Carl Sagan once said that the Vedic timetable of the Vedas was the only religion in the world that had a remotely congruent timetable to science. And he said, doubtless by sheer chance. So he could understand that these two things were roughly congruent, but he couldn't appreciate that there was some reasoning behind it. All right, so now we're going to go specifically into religious history here. So again, we go from Vedic culture, but Vedic culture had an elaborate theology right at the very beginning. It wasn't that it gradually evolved, that the sages knew about meditation, they knew about reincarnation, they talked about karma, they talked about the subtle body, they talked about atoms. And this stuff was way, way back there. As we said, 3000 BCE, that's when they wrote it down. But before that, it was word of mouth. And so we have, these ancient time periods, 6,000, 5,000 BC, Sumerian culture. We have a thing called the Enuma Elish. They had various gods. This is a very unusual culture, the Sumerian culture. These gods were not at all recognizable like the ones in the Vedic, group of demigods. That the Vedic group of demigods, we have, we see them all over the world, other places. That the Scandinavians worship very similar demigods. The Egyptians worship very similar demigods. We see the Chinese worship demigods. Even in the Americas, people were worshiping various demigods. The idea of the sun god is pretty much all over the world. Even Polynesians had these kind of ideas. So wherever you go, this idea of the demigods are there. The thing that's kind of interesting is the Sumerians have a different set, and I'm not sure about how that works, but it's a little bit interesting there. So then we have Egyptian culture. They had demigods. The Judaic culture, they supposedly, people always say this, they were the first to come up with monotheism. But it's not true. The Vedas are monotheistic. They're just, we have in the Vedic understanding many demigods. We don't see them as God. We see them as sub-gods or empowered living beings like us, but they are simply servants of the Supreme Being. There's only one Supreme Being, and he's in a different class. So, at any rate, we have then Greek culture, 1200 BCE. That's where, only till we get to about when Greek culture starts getting into the pre-Socratics do we get down into naturalism. Naturalism means that these pre-Socratic Greeks, they believed that there are no supernatural causes, only natural causes. And from that point onward, Western philosophy has kicked out supernatural causes. And that's why Western philosophy is what it is. It's why Western history is what it is. It's why Western religion had to fight against it and was not doing so well, and so on and so forth. Then we have Buddhist culture starting at about 500 BCE, because Vedic culture had degenerated because of Kali Yuga coming on. And Buddhist culture rose to prominence more and more. And then by about 260 BCE, Emperor Ashoka made Buddhism the national religion of India. So at that point, the Vedic religion was submerged, and India became at least largely Buddhist, because the king, he made Buddhism the national or the overriding religion. Of course, I'm sure there were some people who held with Vedas. I don't think Emperor Ashoka was particularly, trying to destroy other religions. He just he made the Vedas he made the Buddhism prominent. Now, by 90 Common Era, Christian culture begins to dominate, and then eventually Eastern and Western Christianity separate, the great schism. Then 300 CE, Roman culture accepts Christianity, and Christianity becomes the default religion of the Western Roman Empire, actually of the Roman Empire in general, and then gradually two different versions of Christianity come out of that. And then, from about 325 to 787 Common Era, Christianity sorts things out. They have 7 ecumenical councils, and they try to discover, what was really Jesus all about. Was he a man? Was he not a man? Was he God? Was he God and man? Was he two people? What do we mean by being saved? All these kind of things. It took them about 7 ecumenical councils to sort all that out. And then in 600 to 700, Christian culture was challenged by Islam. So Islam came and tried to conquer various Christian cultures, mostly the Byzantine Empire, because that was closer than Rome was. So they fought, and they won some, they lost some, and this went back and forth, But when we get into the 1000s, that's when Vedic culture got completely conquered by Islam. When, not completely, only northern India. So at that point, Muhammad Ghazi, he came and made incursions, and that's why a big portion of India today is Muslim, because at that time the Muslims came from the West and invaded India. So this gives you a little bit of understanding historically how all these things break down. Any questions about that?
I've never heard of Vedic culture. Sorry.
No, don't give it to him. Hold it for him.
I've never heard of Vedic culture. Can you explain that to me? What that is?
Yeah. So the Vedas, Veda means knowledge, and in ancient India, there are writings, many writings, and they're all written in Sanskrit. And this body of information was the philosophical and religious basis of an entire culture of India since very, very long time ago. As we've been talking about, this spoken narrative, the Vedas, was delivered by various people who would memorize it. And about 5,000 years ago, it was written down in a language called Sanskrit or Devanagari script. And that's what we have today. So this is a continuing tradition. And, we have 4 Vedas, the Rig, Sama, Atharva, Yajur Veda. These are called also sometimes the Samhitas. Then we have the Aranyakas, the Brahmanas, and the Upanishads. And then we have the Vedanta Sutra. Then we have the Itihasas. And then finally we have the Vedanta Sutra. And after that, what's called the Brahma Sutra or the Srimad Bhagavatam. So we have all these various Vedic writings. This is like roomfuls of writing. Any other questions? Okay, so I want to sort of finish this up because I'm running longer than I wanted to here. So this is why, if you were to study about the Bhagavad Gita in a college, what you would hear is what's called the critical, historical, or the empirical approach. Bhagavad Gita was an interesting writing. Many people have different things to say about it. It is an interesting group of ideas that are part of an ancient system, but we have to understand that this was mythology, that we can't take many of these things seriously because it's, after all, mythology. It was written so long ago. And one person says the Vedas are this, or the Bhagavad Gita is this. Someone else will say it's something else. And that's why Prabhupada came to this point that we talked about last week of Bhagavad Gita as it is, meaning Bhagavad Gita explained the way the Bhagavad Gita actually is itself meant to be explained. You can spin anything you want out of Bhagavad Gita, but that doesn't make it Bhagavad Gita. What makes it Bhagavad Gita is that it is, as we said last week, a Siddhantic version. In other words, it's harmonious with the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita. And the spirit of the Bhagavad Gita is delivered by the disciplic succession, a line of teachers coming all the way back to, as we said, all the way back to Krishna and Brahma, the very beginning of the day of Brahma. So there's an unbroken line of teachers, and they keep the central focus of what the Gita has to say. When you go outside that central focus, you find that you can't harmonize the Gita. You'll find parts that don't work anymore. So that's why we have this idea of Gita as being a harmonious whole. It works together. It's not just a miscellaneous box of, kind of self-help clues. It's a full philosophy, a consistent philosophy. Okay, so the Gita is approached in the modern world as a system of scholarship. But we say Bhagavad Gita needs to be approached by applying it. So scholars study Bhagavad Gita and they think about, well, what happened back then? Who was alive at that time? Do we have any archaeological evidence? That's the way they think about Bhagavad Gita. Whereas we think about Bhagavad Gita according to, we hear various things, we apply them in our lives, we see, do they really work? Because Bhagavad Gita is a list of explanations of what we call bhakti, the process of self-purification and of connecting with the Supreme Lord through chanting and through service. So in the modern academic understanding of Indology, so Indology is the study of India, and Indian things. And in colleges, this is the way that you would run into Bhagavad Gita. You would run into it as an Indological study, I guess is the way it would be pronounced. And they would approach it from historical, anthropological, archaeological, and philology. Philology, by the way, is the study of literature, especially ancient literatures. So we've talked about how in India it's difficult to research the history of India. There is no history of India other than the Vedas. Whereas, in Rome and Greece, you had Livy and Herodotus and people like that who were historians of those cultures. But the history of India is the Vedas. That was what it was. There was no reason or need to write another history. So another way that we see that in modern schools that the idea of Bhagavad Gita is approached is through glottochronology, which is this kind of dubious study of how languages change. So languages change, according to time. There's no doubt that they do. But that you can quantify and predict how those languages are going to change and come up with some projections and understandings about what's going to happen or what did happen or who was next to who or what ideas or people came from where. This is, even now, it's not really, seen very deeply as, realistic. All right, so any questions about that? So this is the way that Bhagavad Gita would be approached in a college, and this is the reason why we're not approaching it this way. And we're giving more and more reasons for why a different approach is necessary. We don't take Gita as mythology. We are approaching it as a application ourselves. In other words, one person put it as the Western or empirical collegiate approach is as information. Bhagavad Gita is information, whereas our Vedic applicational approach is transformation. We are not trying to give people information. We're trying to help them to get transformation. So let me then now give you all, there's two of you who don't, or maybe three of you who aren't on the Gita from Zero, what do you call it? What's up chat, So I'm giving people little tests. It's only 4 questions, but